Wonderful. So thank you so much, Irene, and everyone for the invitation. It's a wonderful privilege and honour to talk to you, even if obviously in, terrible circumstances. When Irene first got in touch with me about this lecture series, she mentioned that the focus was going to be on parallels, echoes, and lessons from classical antiquity for modern reality, especially those that can offer insights into the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And she also mentioned themes such as imperialism, the fall of empires, nation building, totalitarianism, and propagandistic myths as being of particular interest. So all of these themes obviously chime with the current state of affairs, but funnily enough, they also have a bearing on some research which I completed a little while ago now. And this was looking at the type of narrative structures which recur, which come back and back in Nazi interpretations of the decline and fall of empires. So what I want to do today for the next 40 minutes or so is to look at these National Socialist interpretations of history, which, as we might expect, are heavily dominated by biologizing, by racist assumptions. Now, the notion that the destinies of all races, nations and empires were governed by universal biological laws of nature first began to gain ground during the later half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And this was popularized by authors such as Arthur de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who you may have come across. But arguably, these ideas truly came into their own during the Third Reich. What we find, whether in relation to the rise and fall of the Roman Empire or the Greek city-states, the workings of the British Empire, or even the supposed mission of the Third Reich itself, under Nazism, all of these types of historical events began to be presented in a way which tried to discredit all so-called deviant or non-racially motivated interpretations of world history. In particular, it was supposed to be proved that decline and fall was always the product of so-called racial degeneration, the intermarriage of supposedly superior with inferior races. And in this line of thinking, Nazi Germany would supposedly fulfill the promise of the 1,000-year Reich precisely because its inhabitants would learn from ancient history or more modern history and not commit the same mistakes as their allegedly Aryan forebears had done. And this could be, for example, the Persians, the Spartans, or Athenians even, and ancient Romans as well. So any historical period that had culture was somehow supposed to be Aryan in this reading. We could see this kind of conception as perhaps crucial to what we might call the metaphysics of National Socialist history. And such ideas were often seen as a refinement of, or even an improvement upon, theories of cultural decline, which were put forward by commentators such as Oswald Spengler, and then were eagerly taken up by leading Nazi theorists or ideologues such as Hans Strasser Günther, who was also known as the race pope popularly, or Alfred Rosenberg, but also by Hitler himself. And the sort of cover image on the slides that I've put there, it sort of shows both Gobineau and Hitler, this kind of development. And we can arguably see these overarching historical narratives of racial degeneration gradually developing little by little. Gobineau's essay on the inequality of human races could be seen as the genesis here, but then we find further reception and development by Chamberlain by these ideologues whom I've mentioned. But I don't just want today to consider these racial or racist interpretations of historical declines and falls on their own terms. Rather, I want to show that although initially just believed by a minority of racial theorists or pseudo-scholars at the turn of the 20th century, these ideas ultimately came to influence actual policy making in the Third Reich, and particularly in the spheres of law and education. And as a case study today, I will be talking about a range of history textbooks which were approved by the government in Nazi Germany, the Reich Education Ministry, and they were used in secondary schools throughout this period. And if we look at these textbooks, they really show how widespread these narratives of racial decline had become, and also how important they were perceived to be educationally, pedagogically, in conformity with Hitler's own Weltanschauung. And in particular, I want to argue or suggest that this inculcation, this teaching of a particular racial historical framework actually follows very closely a model of schematic narrative templates, which was devised by a sociologist called James V. Wirch, and I've put two of his most important works on this on the slide here. So what Wirch has shown is that a crucial element in forming collective identity, often national identity, is provided by forcing historical events to fit into a kind of consistent, unchanging narrative framework, which is then used both to justify and to legitimize the actions of the ruling power or the nation in question. And Wirch's theory here is particularly interesting because a lot of his research on templates is from Russian history, and the examples which he gives, which I'll talk about in a second, really illuminate the kind of historical posturing or myth-making which we've seen from Putin, from the Russian propaganda machine in recent weeks and months. So I will be modifying Wirch's theory in certain respects, but his ideas on this seem to be a kind of valuable springboard if you like, for considering both the form and the impact of these racialized versions of history. So before I go on to look at the case study, these textbooks, kind of more specific aspects of the phenomenon, I'll just give a brief expose, kind of précis of the main points of Roche's theory. And he first set this out in a monograph from 2002, Voices of Collective Remembering, and then later clarified them somewhat in a 2009 article on collective memory, which is in this volume on the right. So, as I mentioned, his main area of expertise is Russian history, and particularly how Russian history is portrayed in Soviet and post-Soviet educational material. And this is where his classic example of a schematic narrative template at work comes from. It's also influenced by Vladimir Prop's work on the schematization of Russian folk tales and by Frederick Bartlett's work on remembering. So the schematic narrative template imposes a basic plot structure on a huge range of specific characters, events, and circumstances, but it always has the same elements as follows. Firstly, an initial situation in which Russia is supposedly peaceful and not interfering with others. 2, the initiation of trouble in which a foreign enemy viciously and wantonly attacks Russia without provocation. 3, Russia almost loses everything in total defeat as it suffers from the enemy's attempts to destroy it as a civilization. And then 4, through heroism and exceptionalism against all odds, Russia acting alone triumphs and succeeds in expelling the foreign enemy. And this is what he calls the expulsion of foreign enemies template from Russian history. And his argument is that this has been used to frame Russian understanding of many key historical episodes. This could include the Napoleonic invasion and the Second World War from Operation Barbarossa onwards, so-called Great Patriotic War. And what he also argues is that, okay, at first glance, this type of framework may not seem intrinsically particularly Russian. You could potentially replace Russia with America in any given instance and produce a narrative which something like Pearl Harbor could fit into. But what he argues is that it's particularly common, particularly prevalent in the Russian narrative tradition and collective remembering. And he compares this with what he thinks of as quite different narratives which feature in American collective memory, which he says focus on narratives like the reluctant hegemon or the mystique of manifest destiny or quest for freedom. So those are the narrative templates that he ascribes to Russia. Or even an alternative trope, he mentions that outsiders looking at Russian history and perhaps we today would use that of expansive imperialism. And he concludes by remarking, quote, "The expulsion of foreign enemies template clearly plays a central role in Russian collective memory, even in instances when it would not seem relevant, at least to those who are not native speakers of this tradition." So what Roche goes on to do in his book is to analyze a whole corpus of Soviet and post-communist textbooks on Russian history, all of which clearly seem to conform to this schematic narrative template in one way or another. And at the core of his argument, there is also an assumption that state-sponsored histories are intended to provide the foundation for a strong collective identity or national identity. And that's also important here. So building on this foundation, I would suggest that what we find in racial theories in the Third Reich and textbooks from Nazi Germany is a sort of analogous template which persistently shows history in terms of victorious, conquering Aryan races taking over weaker ones and then suffering what they called de-Aryanization or de-Nordicization through so-called defilement of their blood. And I would say this is also a state-sponsored attempt to create a narrative template of this type, almost from new, and to impose it on the population at large. So I won't go in any more detail into the genesis of these ideas prior to the Third Reich. Maybe we can discuss that afterwards. But what I think it would be good to do now is look at some of the ways in which the specific Nazi textbooks put the template into practice. And I'll take a few passages as case studies, and it won't be all on ancient history, but there is predominantly an ancient historical focus because of the nature of the audience here. So turning to the textbooks themselves, what I did in order to explore the ways in which these racist narratives were incorporated into, if you like, the historical canon of Nazi pedagogy in this template form, was to analyse an entire series of history textbooks entitled Volk und Führer, Deutsche Geschichte für Schulen, People and Leaders, or Race and Leaders, German History for Schools. And these were widely used in secondary schools throughout the Third Reich. The overall editor of the series was a notorious Nazi educational propagandist called Dietrich Klages, but each book within the series was written by a different author or group of authors. So the collection taken together provides a sort of microcosm or a laboratory where we can see these narrative templates being used in practice. During the research, I did obviously look at other series of textbooks too, but in order that the lecture won't end up being too long, Volk und Führer will be the primary case study for today, and I'll just look at a little bit of other material towards the end. And as a control, I also used some secondary literature, so Gilmer Blackburn's Education in the Third Reich, a study of race and history in Nazi textbooks, and Hans-Jürgen Apel and Stefan Bittner's Humanistische Schulbildung, 1890 to 1945, and I've got a bibliography slide at the end which has those on. But basically these two books in particular engaged with a broader corpus of primary material, and so I could use them to check whether my hypotheses, my ideas, were borne out by more general analysis. So the first textbook in this series just contained collections of stories about German heroic or Germanic personalities through the ages. It wasn't necessarily quite so fruitful. But looking at the second book in the series, Die Germanen, the Germans, by Paul Vogel, there are many examples of the narrative template in practice. And I've selected an account which is the very climax, the denouement of the volume. And I'll quote this at length because it shows very clearly what's going on, how the template works. But the template for a classic decline and fall is very clear, even in the title and the subtitle of the section. It's called Das Reich Karls zerbricht, Charles's empire disintegrates, and then völkischer Zerfall, racial ruin. And the account which follows is also quite strongly anti-religious, particularly anti-Catholic, which is interesting. So I'm going to quote from this at some length. Since the Merovingian era, a disastrous development had already begun in the western Frankish regions of Gaul. Under Frankish, Gothic and Burgundian masters, there lived a numerous Romano-Celtic population. Their strength was soon increased by countless Germanic farmers who had had to give up their liberty due to the burdens of war and the Depression. After they had become slaves, they felt a closer bond with the racially alien Romano-Celtic subjects, in that the disenfranchisement and poverty which they shared was identical than they did with their free ruling compatriots. As slaves, they were no longer allowed to contract marriages with their kindred freemen, yet they were permitted to marry slaves of an alien blood and alien race. Soon there commenced a full blending between the destitute element of the Frankish people and the Romano-Celtic subjects. Therefore, the Franks, due to their small numbers, almost always abandoned their language. The leading Franks seemed to be struck blind. Most of them saw the danger which lay in the ruin of their people, but dared say nothing, since Latin was simultaneously the language of the church. Soon, however, the decline had progressed so far that Kaiser Karl himself could no longer prevent it. Now the few remaining Frankish families confronted a new race, which was neither Roman nor Frankish. Very often, a subject people absorbs a racially alien ruling caste into itself. The Franks experienced this truth at first hand in the west of their empire. The German conquerors had become too short-sighted and credulous. They had done too little for the preservation and strengthening of the Frankish people. So, firstly, you'll notice that at various points, there are passages which are underlined and in italics. These were also heavily emphasized in the text itself. So this is not my underlining or italicization. This is from the textbook itself. And you may also notice that the passages which particularly show and highlight the racial narrative and, if you like, the narrative template in question are those which the original text emphasizes. So the moral of the story, if you like, is in no doubt. Meanwhile, the second part of the story, which is subtitled Staatlicher Zerfall, Political Ruin, is obviously considered much less important and also completely based on the racial decline that has been outlined. So this is kind of paradigmatic. it exemplifies the ways in which these stories are constructed. If we move on to the next textbook in the series, which is called Das Erste Deutsche Reich, 900 to 1648, the First German Reich, by Paul Vogel and Waldemar Hoffmann. A similar template is used to explain the demise of the Holy Roman Empire. So in this case, the authors argue that although Otto the Great managed to remain both an emperor and a German king, this wasn't possible for the sovereigns who succeeded him, concentrating too much on conquering and subduing Italy rather than on strengthening their position in the East and consolidating it. They ended up wasting untold German lives in their quest for a hopeless victory in the South. And I don't think I have a slide for this quote because it's quite short, but the quotation is, "Fatal consequences. The more brilliant and glorious the German emperor's Italian policy, the more alarming the consequences. Thousands and thousands of men of the best German blood were sacrificed, centuries wasted, in which the German emperors could have achieved something great and long-lasting on German soil." And the argument that they put forward, the story that they tell, is that this exhaustion of the power of Nordic blood led eventually to the loss of the entire Holy Roman Empire, particularly its unity, which Otto I had fought so long and hard to defend. Germany was now merely a Länderstaat, sort of state made up of different lands or regions to which other nations could dictate at will. And the final quote is, "Soon all that was left of the proud greatness of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was a name." In book 4, similar considerations are used by the authors Gerhard Stark and Walter Franke to explain Germany's extreme weakness after the 30 Years' War. Again, the argument is the blood of the Germanic peasantry had been weakened so much that the ultimate success of France and the other states surrounding Germany in dictating Germany's fate becomes a foregone conclusion. And even mass emigration, whether to Eastern Europe or to the United States, is considered in terms of the grave dangers for Germany of the loss of Germanic blood. So suffice it to say that in each book we encounter this kind of narrative, but it's the 6th book in the series by Johannes Sillermorn and Walter Franke, which contains the widest range of this narrative template. And this is the one which deals with ancient history. So we come now to the Persians and the Persian Empire first. So the short section on this is entitled The Persian Global Empire under Darius and its Collapse, Das Persische Weltreich unter Darius und sein Verfall. And to quote, "The Nordic trait of clemency towards conquered peoples and races and their suggestibility to alien influences was the Persians' downfall. Thus, the language and culture of the Oriental peoples gained ever stronger influence and led to the degeneration and bastardization of this Nordic race. Oriental pomp grew among the great king's successors, who abetted the racial mixing of Persians with the conquered peoples. Thus, the old warrior spirit disappeared. Aliens continually took up the most important positions as officers in the army and officials at court. And the chapter ends with the resounding conclusion that, quote, "The history of the Aryans in the Eastern world confirms the truth of the saying, quote, all great past cultures perish only because the original creative race died out through poisoning of the blood," again, underlined, heavily emphasized in the text itself. And this contention seems to be exactly what the rest of the book is designed to prove. Now, if we look at the contents for the section on the classical world, the chapter titles and subtitles, we can see this incredibly clearly. So we have, in order, creation and decline of the world of the Greek city-states, Aufbau und Verfall der griechischen Staatswelt. Greece destroys itself in a fratricidal war, the Peloponnesian War. Griechenland vernichtet sich im Bruderkrieg. So the idea there is that Athens and Sparta, they're both, you know, of the same Aryan stock, so that killing each other is contributing to the problem of de-Nordification. Blossoming and decay of Greek culture, Blüte und Verfall der griechischen Kultur, the political and cultural destruction of the Greek world, der politische und kulturelle Untergang der griechischen Welt, causes of the collapse, this is moving on to the Roman Empire, corruption of the Nordic race, degeneration of community spirit, Ursachen des Zerfalls, Zersetzung der nordischen Rasse, Verfall des Gemeinschaftsgeistes. Then the Flavians grasp at Oriental despotism, die Flavier greifen zum orientalischen Despotismus, ruin in all territories, Zerfall auf allen Gebieten, and then final last-ditch rescue efforts and the collapse, letzte Rettungsversuche und Zusammenbruch. So we can see here that so much of the interpretation of what's going on with all of these, well, empires or kind of ruling powers is seen from this perspective with this particular lens. And I'm going to take an example from the penultimate section, the ruin in all territories, which shows precisely how the narrative template functions, even with a completely different cast of characters, this time from the later Roman Empire, but the outcome in a way seems strangely familiar. So, racial corruption. Hand in hand with migration from the country and depopulation, the alienization of Italy continued unstoppably. Hundreds of thousands of slaves from all countries of the world overwhelmed Italy and became Roman citizens through emancipation, while the Nordic population dwindled away due to wars and civil wars, proscriptions, mass executions, and emigration. The last dam was destroyed by the son of an African and Assyrian woman, Caracalla, when in 212 AD, he granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the entire empire, even to Jews. In doing so, racial death became the Romans' implacable fate. And this kind of rhetoric, this kind of narrative about the classical world and the Roman Empire can also be found in other textbooks which deal with this period. So a series called Geschichtsbücher für die deutsche Jugend, history books for German youth, which is for the same class 6 by Kumsteller, Harker and Schneider, tells this same story of racial narratives. And again, on the contents page, even the titles and the subtitles, like Decay of Ancient Romanhood, Zersetzung des alten Römertums, or the Fall der Rassenpflege, a decline of racial nurturing, really show this being brought to the fore. And the authors also constantly try to prove that Germanic peoples had always been well aware of the dangers of mixing races and had taken active steps to prevent it. One example that they use here is the Spartans. So the Spartans are praised for their Rassenpflege, their preservation of racial integrity, and for the fact that they supposedly took great care to uphold the power of their race and kind of only marry within certain parameters. However, Sparta's eventual downfall is also explained by her inability to sustain numbers of citizens. So her political decline is seen as rooted in a Rückgang der Volkskraft, or decline in racial power. This is also the template used for the fall of Athens as well. It's kind of one size fits all. So chapter 5 in this book, which is also called Fratricidal War and Decline, Bruderkrieg und Zerfall, again referring to the Peloponnesian War, contains subsections called economic, political and racial decline, wirtschaftlicher, politischer und rassischer Verfall, and further degeneration of the democracy, weitere Entartung der Demokratie. And the explanation for this state of affairs runs as follows, quote, "The deepest cause for this transformation of outlook and custom was the fact that the people had become another race in terms of blood. The Nordic master caste, which was responsible for the great deeds and creations of the Greek people, had become extinct. Countless ancient families were wiped out in the civil wars. The peasantry disappeared. Many of the metics and slaves, the majority of whom came from the Orient, rose into the bourgeoisie. People promised slaves freedom and citizenship rights if they fought in the army. It was the custom that skilled slaves ran their own business and bought their freedom from their masters. Close-knit groups of money changers and speculators attained prosperity, and old indigenous families considered it an honor when one married into them. Money mixes the blood of the noble and the base, lamented one perspicacious observer." And in this context, Socrates and Plato are even recruited to this racialized narrative. They are characterized as unheard prophets of doom who saw these dangers, but no one listened to them. And Plato in particular is praised for realizing that, quote, "the recovery of the people or the race is a racial question." Meanwhile, chapter 6 of the book, which looks at the demise of the ancient world, could almost have been lifted straight from work by Houston Stewart Chamberlain. It appeals to the concept of racial chaos. It castigates mixed marriages between Oriental and Asiatic slave populations during the Roman Empire. And there's an idea that because freedmen could marry citizens and quickly, within a few generations, climb the political and social hierarchy, is seen as key to this dangerous racial mixing and de-Aryanization. Then the destruction of the peasantry, the Republican civil wars, and imperial proscriptions are also blamed for constantly weakening the Nordic or Aryan proportion of the Roman population. Then again, I'll just give you the concluding section, which is talking about immigration from the East and declining birth rates, leading to what they see as a triumph of Orientalism. So they write, the history of the Roman people shows us in a unique fashion how a people can rise from the humblest beginnings to become a world power, and how it then sinks again to utter destruction. It shows us the strength which enabled its rise. It shows us the power which led to its decay. The Nordic peoples of Greece and Rome had, in the same manner as the Indians and the Persians, to fight the great fight for physical and cultural self-determination in the midst of a hostile environment. They were beaten in this battle, as were the Indians and the Persians. With insistent warning, their history speaks to us when we trace the causes behind their inability to assert their nature. And so to bring this to a conclusion, of course, there are many other patterns which come to the fore in these textbooks. We get, descriptions of evil Jews, or the inevitability of nations or races needing to win more living space, more Lebensraum. But arguably, these elements are still fitted into the larger decline and fall racial narrative. So when it comes to explaining the rise and fall of empires or peoples, this really does seem to be the template which lies closest to hand. So in conclusion, we might concur with Gilmer Blackburn's observation in this book here. He writes, quote, "The Nazis considered education an exercise for the development of human will. Because all living things struggled to overcome a hostile environment, the school's function was to equip Germans to prevail in this struggle for existence. Nazis, acutely anxious about the future of their race, decreed an education that would equip and unite youth to prevent the reversal of evolution. The urgent tone and the melancholy obsession with death and sacrifice found in National Socialist history grew out of this apprehension," end quote. And in the end, as the Third Reich collapsed around him, even Hitler himself was consumed with the belief that this racial narrative had to reach its terrible conclusion in the extinction of the German people, whom he had led first to victory and then to disaster. So as a kind of counterfactual, the Nazi educational program was intended to change the nation's view of the world and of reality itself. We might wonder whether a future generation of Germans in a longer lived Third Reich might have come to share this kind of absolute belief in schematic narrative templates of race, providing the key to global history. But in this context in which we're speaking today, I think we can also see the parallels between this attempt to impose a narrative on history and the kind of propagandistic imposition of narratives which Russia is peddling today. So that's all for now. Thank you very much. If